Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a horror sci-fi film, Bride of Reanimator. Spoiler ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with the dismembered head of Dr. Hill, the prominent doctor from the previous film who was reanimated. He's now using the body of the Dean. In complete darkness, he swears his revenge upon Herbert and blames all of his misfortune upon him. 8 months later and 10,000 miles away from the massacre that happened in the medical school in the previous movie, Herbert and Dan, who stumbled upon the secret of reanimation, finish their tour as volunteer medics in a bloody civil war. They find a key element for their experiments into the nature of life. Inside the operating room, Herbert argues to Dan that if they don't find a way to save the wounded soldier by removing the shrapnel stuck inside his chest, he will go into cardiac arrest. Dan obeys and lets Herbert remove the shrapnel, causing the wounded soldier to bleed out and die. Dan hits a nearby pole in a fit of rage. Herbert adds that the soldier might still be useful in their experiments. He takes a syringe of glowing green serum from the cabinet and injects the dead body with it. A woman called Francesca enters the tent where the operating room is located and calls the doctors to retreat since the front lines have weakened. She spots Herbert, who's now trying to hold down the reanimated soldier. He sees that it's useless and shoots the zombie in the head. Dan again argues with Herbert and asks if they'll ever stop with his research. He tells Dan that they will never come across another place like this, with a fresh supply of people for their experiments. Francesca asks about what they're doing, and Herbert threatens her with his gun and asks her to leave. She tells them that it's too dangerous because of the situation outside. Dan tries to leave with Francesca, but Herbert stops him and reminds him that their research has already advanced to the point where the only missing variables are hidden within reptiles. He adds that Herbert still doesn't understand that they have gone beyond reanimating the dead and they could potentially create new life. Suddenly, a nearby explosion causes the tent to fall apart. Dan calls out to Francesca, who he sees helping other soldiers to escape. He tells her to leave the area immediately. Enemy soldiers barge inside the tent and injure Dan. Herbert manages to fight them off and carries Dan to safety. Meanwhile, in a hospital bedroom, a patient called Gloria wakes up. Dan introduces her to Herbert, who will be helping out with examinations. She tells Dan that she's scared of the surgery. Dan reassures her that it's merely routine and everything will be fine. A nurse comes in and wheels her to the operating room. Dan pulls Herbert aside and tells him that Gloria is not an experiment. Herbert remarks that she's terminally ill and could be of use to their research. In an autopsy room, a doctor covers up a recent body he performed on. Later on, a man visits him and introduces himself as a lieutenant of the police department. He asks the doctor if he is in charge of the remains of the massacre that happened in the last film. The doctor tells him that the case is already closed, and the lieutenant tells him that the case is not finished for him. He shows the doctor the severed head of Hill and explains that the head is well preserved, considering that the incident happened 8 months ago. The doctor notes that all the other specimens are also well preserved. The lieutenant then points to a spot in the skull that is missing. The doctor leads the lieutenant into the room, where all the other specimens from the incident are kept. The lieutenant notices a bottle of glowing green fluid and asks what it is. The doctor tells him it was something the Hill was working on, and he has not been able to identify what it is exactly. They enter the furnace room. He shows the lieutenant where they burned the debris from the incident. The doctor reveals the body of a woman who committed suicide. He asks why her legs are missing, and the other employee inside the room tells the lieutenant that a lot of body parts have been missing. The doctor shrugs the matter off and says no one would want to steal body parts. In the evening, Herbert comes by the storage, where the body parts from the incident are stored. He takes an interest in a particular body part and pockets it. He then spots the severed head of Dr. Hill wrapped in plastic. He insults it and leaves the room. Later, Dan walks into a basement where they conduct all of their research and store all the stolen body parts. He spots a basket on the table and opens it to find the feet that are missing from earlier. Herbert spooks Dan by emerging from a hole in the wall. He reveals to Dan that the basement shares a wall with an old family crypt. They seal the hole by moving the closet over it. Herbert grabs an iguana from the freezer and begins to conduct his research. After tweaking the blood of the iguana with other chemicals, he creates a new version of the green serum. He attaches pieces of severed fingers together and attaches an eye in the middle. Dan interrupts Herbert and tells him that he wants to move out. Herbert tries to convince him that what they are doing is the key to creating new life. Herbert injects the serum into the severed fingers, and they start to move around the container. Dan gets into a fit of anger and tells Herbert that this isn't what saving lives are about. Herbert tells Dan that when Megan, Dan's fiancée from the last film, was dying, Dan had no problem using the serum to try and save her. He asks Dan what is the thing he loved most about Megan, but while they are talking, the severed fingers escape its container unnoticed. Herbert opens a fridge and shows Dan Megan's heart, which he found earlier in the storage. He asks Dan to help him continue his work and tells him that they could make a new life with Megan's heart. An alarm buzzes from upstairs. Dan leaves to answer the door, and Herbert stays behind and looks for the severed fingers. Dan answers the door and is greeted by the lieutenant. He enters the house and starts looking around. Herbert comes upstairs and asks what the lieutenant wants. Dan spots the severed fingers crawling around on the floor. He tries to catch them while the lieutenant questions Herbert about his relationship with Dr. Hill. The severed fingers made their way to the back of where the lieutenant was sitting. He begins to question the two about the missing body parts from the hospital, but the two of them say that they don't know anything about it. The lieutenant leaves, and Dan and Herbert are able to kill the severed fingers by crushing them with a book. The next day, the doctor examines the green serum and begins running tests to figure out what it does. He uses a dead bat and injects it with the serum. To his disbelief, the bat is resurrected. The bat escapes and attacks the doctor. He manages to hold it down and cut off its wings to prevent it from flying. Herbert makes his way into the furnace room and tells the employee that the doctor wants to see him. He examines the body about to be put into the furnace and places sunglasses on its eyes. Dan arrives with a wheelchair. The doctor takes his experiment to another level by using the serum on Dr. Hill's severed head. After injecting it, he sees that it begins to move its mouth. Dr. Hill asks for more of the serum. He claims to recognize him from his research and calls his theory idiotic. The employee from earlier knocks on his door. He ushers the employee inside and tells him to keep the lights closed. The doctor starts talking to Dr. Hill, but the severed head does not respond. The employee leaves, thinking the doctor is playing a prank on him. Dr. Hill starts speaking once more and warns him not to do that again. Dr. Hill reveals that he has unfinished business and forces the doctor to help him. Meanwhile, Dan and Herbert transport the body using the wheelchair and disguise it as a regular patient. They make it outside of the hospital, but a dog bumps into the wheelchair, causing the sunglasses to fall off. The dog greets Dan, and it returns to her owner, Francesca. She greets Dan, but Herbert warns him not to fancy her too much. She reveals that she's here to do interviews in Boston this week. Dan's pager beeps. He asks Francesca out to dinner before he leaves. The lieutenant questions Francesca about her relationship with Dan. They took an elevator to the floor, where the hospital kept the zombies. He reveals to her the events that transpired in the hospital and the moment where he discovered Dr. Hill's severed head that was still twitching. He takes her to a room where they keep the zombies in. He tells her that his wife also became one of them. The lieutenant's wife grabs Francesca, but luckily they are able to get her out of the room. He tells her that they have never done that before. She asks the lieutenant what Dan has to do with any of this. He tells her that Dan and Herbert are the only survivors, and Dan was found with the dead body of Megan in his arms, still twitching. Back in the basement, Dan and Herbert use the dead body from earlier and attempt to create a new person from it. Dan tells Herbert that this would not work, but he reassures Dan about a method that could potentially be able to do it. The alarm buzzes, and Dan checks to see who is at the front door. Francesca comes by for dinner and brings with her ingredients and her dog from earlier. She hands him a bottle of wine and tells him to open it while she prepares to cook dinner. Outside of the house is the lieutenant observing from his car. She makes pasta sauce and gets Dan to taste it. They both lean in for a tongue massage and sleep together that night. Herbert continues to do his research and administers the green serum on one of the legs. It starts twitching, which delights Herbert. He then starts pouring the green serum on individual body parts, but suddenly the arm and the leg attack him, forcing him to lock them in a container. Later, Herbert heads upstairs and finds the lieutenant waiting for him. He asks him to leave, but the lieutenant forces his way down. He asks Herbert if he truly believes that the dead are dead, pertaining to his wife. He shoves Herbert out of the way and enters the basement, where he sees the recent experiment that Herbert and Dan are attempting. He calls Herbert a butcher and starts attacking him. But Herbert manages to grab a towel with a knockout drug and uses it on the lieutenant. Dan arrives in the basement and yells at Herbert for what he did to the lieutenant. Herbert suggests that they could use him instead as a way of determining whether or not what they were trying to achieve earlier could work. He then injects the lieutenant with the green serum. The lieutenant wakes up and immediately attacks the two of them. Herbert manages to chop off one of the lieutenant's arms and saves Dan from being killed, but the lieutenant escapes, locking the door to the basement. Herbert reopens the hole in the wall and escapes through the family crypt next to them. The lieutenant collapses in the living room, which attracts the attention of Francesca. He grabs her and starts attacking her, but the dog manages to save her at the cost of its own life. Dan breaks open the basement door and runs upstairs, where he sees Francesca grieving the death of her dog. Herbert enters through the main door, looking for the lieutenant. but he cannot find him, so he takes the dog's body away instead. The next day, Francesca sneaks off into the basement, where she finds her dog now turned into a zombie, with a human hand as a replacement for one of its legs. She screams, and Dan comes down to the basement and tries to calm her down, telling Herbert to get the dog out of here. Back in the hospital, Dan visits Gloria again, just as she flatlines. They try to resuscitate her, but they fail. Herbert tells Dan to go home and calm down. Meanwhile, in the doctor's office, Dr. Hill's severed head tells the doctor to take him to Herbert. But the doctor refuses and blocks his mouth with an apple, wraps him in a towel, and throws it into the garbage can. Herbert tells the employee to take Gloria's body into the crematorium. Francesca visits the hospital, but they tell her that he left already. Back in the basement, Dan and Herbert attempt to finally finish the experiment, using Gloria's head as the final piece. Back in the office of the doctor, he sees that Hill escaped the trash can and is now commanding the lieutenant to do his bidding. Francesca tries to make a call in the hospital, but sees the lieutenant who is now transporting the head of Dr. Hill. He grabs her, but she manages to escape. Herbert tells Dan that they are finally ready. Dan notices sounds of rats coming from the walls, but Herbert shrugs it off. Dan insists on injecting the heart with the green serum, and Herbert allows him to. While waiting for the body to show signs of life, the alarm buzzed again. Herbert opens the door to find a wooden box. Francesca arrives at the cemetery, where she finds other zombies that have escaped the hospital. Herbert opens the box and finds Dr. Hill's severed head, now with bat wings directly attached. The lieutenant attacks Francesca, but he's also attacked by his wife. She manages to escape. The body finally rises, and Dan administers CPR to help it breathe. She sits up from the table and starts moving around. Francesca tries to hide from the zombies, but she is found, and she manages to escape to the house. Herbert searches the house for Dr. Hill until he is called by Dan. Herbert sees the body finally rise and is amazed at the life he created. Francesca warns them that the zombies are coming. Herbert and Francesca barricade the basement. Francesca sees that Dan is fascinated by the body and asks who she is. Dan tells her that it is Megan, his fiancée. The zombies use tools to try to break through the basement door. Francesca tries to convince Dan to fight along with them and fend off the zombies, but he is still in complete shock that they managed to create life. She tries to get the body away from Dan, but it attacks her. Dan saves Francesca, which angers the body. The body rips out her heart and offers it to Dan, which he rejects. The body falls apart into a pile of body parts. Zombies under the control of Dr. Hill emerge from the wall and drag Dan, Francesca, and Herbert. The crypt collapses, but Dan and Francesca make it out through the loose dirt. The movie ends with Dr. Hill buried by the collapsed crypt, laughing as he manages to take Herbert out with him. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.